Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Iona Hine. I am the Programme Manager of the Cambridge Interfaith Programme, which is the co-host of today's event, hosted jointly with the Department of Politics and International Studies here at the University of Cambridge. We have a good number of people joining us online, and we are also recording this at the kind permission of our speaker. Before I hand over to our academic director to make the formal introductions, I just want to take the opportunity to say a few words about our programme and why we co-host events like this. So if you excuse that bit. So we're a research centre. We host research seminars in the Faculty of Divinity, including these two that are coming up fairly soon. And in addition to research, we also try to make sure that the research reaches the people who would be interested to hear about it and where it's meaningful for them to hear about it. So that means we're very interested in connecting with everybody, but we're particularly interested in connecting with people like educators and policymakers and getting the word out. One of the ways we do that is by supporting book launches. So again, I just put up a few book launches that are coming up under our umbrella. We also do innovative things. I like to think it's innovative. Like we have some research practice speed dating coming up where we're bringing in practitioners and professionals from different kinds of external organisations and helping them have quick meet and greets with academics to see what kinds of collaboration and synergy come out of that. One of my colleagues said, it's not really speed dating, is it? I was like, it is. It's just that the aim isn't that you find a life partner for your romantic life, is that you find some, really meaningful collaboration. And if that's lifelong, great. We also are increasingly moving into a policy space. I'm really delighted that we're hosting tonight's event. It was suggested to us by Sarah Silvestri, who's here in the audience, who is also has agreed to collaborate with us on our boot camp on religion and policy, which I'm literally announcing this moment. So that's coming up in June, and we'll be working with emergent researchers to help think through what it means to share research and do that is policy relevant, and particularly with an eye to matters of religion and faith that maybe people find a little bit more difficult to talk about, think about, and connect. That feels like more than enough, but I had one cheeky thing that I'm going to say before Esra comes up, because last week, in the course of some of my general work, I came across this paragraph in a book. The paragraph is headed, Secular Bias in Western Diplomacy. It says, in their thoughtful 2015 Brookings Institution article, the author of this chapter is for the Brookings Institution, so I just will say that. Peter Mandaville and Sarah Silvestri discuss secular bias in Western diplomacy. They point to a bureaucratic cultural aversion to engaging the issue of religion and religious actors because of a common embrace of modernisation theory that posits religious issues represent an outdated, non-progressive element of society that is not worthy of engagement and will ultimately die out. Mandaville and Silvestri argue that diplomats currently operate at a distinct disadvantage insofar as they tend to operate in the realm of realpolitik, in which issues of identity, culture and faith are largely irrelevant, compounded by a normative bias towards secularism. End quote. What a delightful thing to discover literally the week before hosting you, and I feel like it's a terrific endorsement for the kind of work that we aim to do, and we're absolutely delighted to be hosting you this evening. But I'll now hand over to Esra, who's going to say something far more elegant. Professor Esra Özrat.
We're here. We're really happy that Peter is with us. I just learned that he will be coming back, maybe. Do you know when about? So we'll have a little bit more of him to learn from him. And he's definitely the most amazing person who connects religion with policy and then the really important policy making institutions. So we'll be coming back to you to learn about it. So how to do it. So Dr. Peter Mandaville, whose work has really influenced me when I was writing about my book about Salafism, about Germans who convert to Islam. So I'm really happy to be hosting him. He's a professor of international affairs in Charles School of Policy and Government and director of the Abu Suleiman Center for Global Islamic Studies in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at George Mason University. And then his connections where he served is all these important names for big organizations that we're all familiar with. For example, from 2024 to 25, he was the director of the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnership and senior advisor for faith engagement at the United States Agency for USAID. And from 2022 to 24, he was senior advisor for religion and inclusive societies at USIP, the United States Institute of Peace. And then he engaged with the US State Department's policy and planning. Also, he was the senior advisor in the Secretary of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs. So more important than all this service that he conducted, to me at least, as a scholar, he is the author of Geopolitics and Religious Soft Power. It came in 2023. Wahhabism and the World in 2022. Islam and Politics, the third edition came up in 2020. Translational Muslim Politics, Reimagining the Ummah, 2001, and many other journal articles and also lots of contributions to newspapers. So I am excited to hear his new work on new geopolitics of faith. So here is Peter Mandaville.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out for the talk. I want to first express my thanks to the Divinity faculty in the Department of Politics and Studies here at Cambridge for hosting me, and particularly my old friend and colleague of many years standing, Dr. Sara Silvestri, who I think really made it possible for me to be with you today. Ezra, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And it reminds me that I wanted to say something about the context and the vantage point from which I approach these issues. My more conventional academic work is very much in the field of Islamic studies, particularly looking at transnational Muslim socio-political and intellectual movements. My earliest research, my PhD work actually was on British Muslim youth here in the UK in the 1990s. And this set of topics that really explore the intersection of religion and geopolitics is a set of questions and issues that I got interested in, not wearing my academic hat, but rather while I was serving in some of the policymaking and governmental roles that Ezra had mentioned. I had the opportunity to serve as a member of former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's policy planning staff from 2010 to 2012. At a time that the US State Department was thinking about whether or not we need to maybe create a dedicated office or unit or some capacity to understand and think about the role of religion in US foreign policy and the ways in which the growing awareness of religion as an important force in societies around the world might be something that American diplomats need to better understand and also have better capacity to kind of integrate into the work that they do. And we were eventually successful in making the case to create such an office. And then I later had the opportunity to serve under former Secretary of State John Kerry, for whom that was a bit of a kind of pet project, the creation of that office, to be part of the team that kind of figured out how you go about installing the function of religious engagement into the US Department of State. More recently, though, I have been serving in the previous Biden-Harris administration as the director of faith partnerships at the U.S. Agency for International Development, a federal government agency that, as you may have seen, has been much in the headlines of late due to the efforts of the current U.S. administration to effectively dismantle it, a process which started 3 days after I left the agency. So happy to talk about that as well. But really the main point that I want to make is that I come at these questions kind of primarily from the point of view of someone who's been trying to figure out their relevance within the context of practical policymaking. But I'm also exploring them in the context of a more conventional academic project. And this is an initiative that I've been leading at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs since 2018. It's a multi-year research project funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York called the New Geopolitics of Religion. And it's not really my work. My role in it is to try to connect and aggregate scholars from around the world whose own work has been exploring the intersection of religion and geopolitics, religion and foreign policy, religion and the external relations of many different states around the world, in the hope that by putting them all together in the context of a single project, their sort of individual atomized interventions, when put together, will allow us to better understand what the global picture of all of this looks like. Dr. Stacey Gutkowski, who's with us in the room from King's College London, has been a contributor to the project. The project has so far put out 2 edited volumes with Oxford University Press, one called Wahhabism in the World, Understanding Saudi Arabia's Global Impact on Islam, an issue that has been much discussed and debated over the years, but had never actually been properly studied academically. So we were very proud to do that. And then more recently, a volume that came out last year called The Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power, How States Use Religion in Foreign Policy. And in some ways, the talk that I'm giving this afternoon is a rather, admittedly, superficial top-line overview of some of the key themes and ideas that we've been exploring in the project. And if you're interested to learn more, you can just Google Berkeley Center Geopolitics of Religious Soft Power, and you'll find yourself on the landing page for the project, and there you will find literally dozens of working papers and commentary pieces and videos of talks that scholars from around the world who have contributed to this project are all gathered together. So there's plenty of material to explore for those of you who may be interested in this. But the crux of what I want to talk about this afternoon is this question of the ways in which a variety of states around the world have increasingly been incorporating religion and various forms of religious outreach into their external relations and foreign policy, trying to understand how we should think about the significance of that and its meaning in the context of a time when, as I think we're all aware, not least of all because of the headlines of the last 24 hours, 36 hours, 72 hours, so much is happening so fast, right? You can't keep track of it. But it's clear that we are seemingly living through some fundamental shifts in the nature of world order and shifts in global power. And I want to argue that there's new and significant ways in which religion is part of that. When I started this work, I began to thematize it in terms of what I call religious soft power, building on uses of that terminology that other scholars of religion and international relations, such as Jeffrey Haynes, have been working on for a few years. I have been trying to use it in a way that is more directly derivative of the classic statement on the idea of soft power in international relations contained in the work of the American international relations scholar Joseph Nye, who coined this term soft power in the early 90s to refer to the idea that in addition to the conventional sources of power that any state has, such as military and economic power, some states have the ability to convince other actors in international relations to do what they want them to do without having to give them money or blow them up by leveraging things like their ideas, their values, norms, culture. And this idea is one that I wanted to explore by kind of putting a religious, kind of playing with a kind of religiously inflected formulation of the same concept. In understanding the machinations of how this works, I've drawn on the work of fellow scholars who work at the intersection of religion and international relations, like Dr. Gregorio de Pisa of Exeter University, who's played around with a concept that he terms sacred capital, right? And it's a version of, some of you will be familiar with the kind of basic idea of social capital coming out of political sociology. And he's kind of riffing on that with this notion of sacred capital. And in doing so, he's trying to recognize that there are certain countries that, by virtue of the particular relationship they have with a given religious tradition, historically, geographically, they have the ability to leverage and deploy geopolitically the power and social force of religion as a component of their broader external relations. And so, in thinking about how to define religious soft power, I kind of mashed together soft power and sacred capital. For a moment. Okay, great. Here ends the sort of more conceptual, theoretical piece. There are any number of questions and concerns one could raise about the theoretical commitment to the idea of soft power as a way to explain these. And indeed, in the Geopolitics of Soft Power book, I invited a couple of international relations theorists to interrogate the utility and validity of soft power as a way to kind of understand and thematize what I'm getting at. So if you want to delve into the theoretics around this, there are some reference points for that. With the balance of time that I have, I actually want to get more into the empirics of it. What does this actually look like in the world? This project that I mentioned had two phases to it. The first phase was looking comparatively at the ways in which Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey integrate Islam into their respective foreign policies, and how we should think about the ways in which their respective histories, positionalities, and regional and world orders has an impact on the valence that religion plays in the way that they engage the world. And then in the second phase of the project, it literally went global and took on board case studies, including Brazil, across to Indonesia, Central Asia is in there. I do want to give you a little bit of that global flavor, the global tour, briefly, but then to look in a little bit more detail at the two cases of Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is just a material that I'm naturally much more comfortable with as someone who otherwise works in the field of Middle East and Islamic studies. So even though I'm going to go on to look at a couple of cases from the Middle East, I think it is important to understand the broader global context of this. A number of countries, significant geopolitical players today, including some cases that I think are quite counterintuitive, incorporate various forms of religious engagement and outreach into their external relations and foreign policy. Many of you will be familiar with the close and symbiotic relationship that has developed between the Kremlin and the Russian Orthodox Church under the presidency of Vladimir Putin, where it's often portrayed as a case of kind of Putin having Russian Orthodox Moscow Patriarch under his thumb and using the Russian Orthodox Church as a way to provide a sort of religious underpinning to the whole Ruski Mir, Russia World project, providing religious justification, of course, for the invasion of Ukraine. But I think there's much more to it than that. I think this relationship has, and I have observed firsthand in my more practical foreign policy and development work, the ways in which Russian Orthodox Church engagement in contexts such as sub-Saharan Africa have fundamentally transformed the cultural politics around any number of issues in that region. And I think it's also important to understand that this is a two-way relationship insofar as the Russian Orthodox Church also gets something out of this in terms of changes that have been made to aspects of Russia's law, Russia's constitution, that kind of make greater cultural space for the normative agendas of the Russian Orthodox Church, if I can put it that way. India is absolutely relevant to consider here. Many of you will know that President Modi has very close ties to the broader RSS social movement itself, one of the exponents of the broader Hindutva movement. And there is any number of kind of transnational Hindutva networks that have been having significant impact in countries where you have, for example, Hindu minority populations, encouraging them to be more forthright in claiming their rights as religious minorities. At times in certain places, such as Bali in Indonesia, this has also led to new dynamics of intercommunal conflict tension as well. China, to me, is the most interesting counterintuitive case, right? Because usually when you hear China and religion, you think of a Chinese Communist Party that is generally anti-religion, right? You think of the suppression of religious groups in China itself. You think of the commission of mass atrocities against segments of China's Muslim population in its western provinces. Those are the images that you generally that come to mind when you think of China and religion. In fact, we have seen a trend over the last 10 years where China has increasingly been reaching into its own Buddhist heritage and deploying that heritage as a soft power tool to build connections of solidarity in countries that have significant Buddhist populations along the geography of its broader Belt and Road initiative. You can literally track the geography of this soft power outreach through the way that set of investments is arrayed. And so it's a fascinating shift that is fantastically counterintuitive given what we generally think of. Brazil, particularly under former President Bolsonaro, Pentecostal Christianity has been one of the fastest growing trends in the kind of religious landscape of Brazil, and particularly under Bolsonaro, his government provided various forms of support, financial and diplomatic, to Brazilian Pentecostal groups that were rapidly establishing transnational connections to co-religionists, other Pentecostals in Lusophone parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Israel, I think, is always important and interesting to consider here. And again, a case where there's been some fascinating shifts when one thinks about efforts on the part of Israel to deploy, the unique connections of Israel to one particular religious tradition, Judaism, obviously, abroad. You would often think of the idea of Israel building close connections with Jewish communities in the United States, for example, and relying on those connections and those sort of diaspora connections to provide for elements of political lobbying and advocacy in the American political system on behalf of Israel. Over the course of the last generation, by virtue of shifts in the political disposition of particularly younger segments of the American Jewish population, which have tracked more to the left and kind of broadly more pro-Palestinian, I think it's fair to say, you've seen Israel shift the center of gravity of its outreach efforts religiously to segments of the conservative American evangelical population, who have really established themselves as the most steadfast base of political support for Israel in the United States. And so you see these very thick tendrils of connection between a number of Israeli groups and Christian Zionist groups. And those of you who follow headlines will know that recently one of the first, if not the first, ambassador that the new Trump administration announced was former Arkansas Governor Mick Huckabee, who is an avowed Christian Zionist. This is someone who denies the existence of the West Bank as a thing, instead insisting that it should be called Judea and Samaria, as Israel does, and insisting that the settlers living in parts of it, viewed as illegal settlers in international law, are actually citizens of a greater Israel. And so he comes directly out of that. There are questions that can be asked about whether, given the sort of theological and eschatological orientations of the Christian Zionist movement, whether investing too much in that side of things is in Israel's longer term interest, but that's a different conversation to be had. And of course, the United States itself has had a complex relationship with religion in its foreign policy. The US Constitution, the Establishment Clause of the US Constitution, creates certain guardrails that limit the extent to which the US federal government can engage in activities that appear to endorse religion or particular interpretations of religion. And case law has generally fell on the side of suggesting that this aspect of the US Constitution applies abroad as well. So in its kind of overt diplomatic work, you have not seen as much direct US engagement with religion. I've had connections to a lot of it in recent years and have really myself struggled with the ways in which the Establishment Clause of the Constitution creates certain barriers to certain kinds of activities. But it is absolutely the case that, particularly during the Cold War, the United States was very happy to find creative ways to provide support to religious causes in countries that were viewed as being under threat of a communist or socialist insurrection, right? With the idea that perhaps religion and support for religious causes could be a useful antidote to godless atheism and support for those trends coming out of Moscow. And so you would see the US government providing support, often through third parties, often, frankly, through more covert means. And because I'm about to segue into the Saudi Arabia case, there's a really interesting example of this that I don't think is widely known that I want to share. Those of you who follow developments in Saudi Arabia, as I do obsessively, remember that there was an interview that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman gave a few years ago, where he was asked about this idea that Saudi Arabia has been exporting the very austere, rigid form of Salafi Islam, commonly known as Wahhabism, around the world, and that this export of Wahhabism had fundamentally distorted understandings and practices of Islam in countries around the world. And is this true? Has Saudi Arabia been doing this? And the Crown Prince said that we haven't been doing that much of it, and anything like that we did do, it was because the United States asked us to. And a lot of people were like, what is he talking about? There is a much broader story about that to be told, and I'll move on to it in a moment. But his reference to the United States asking Saudi Arabia to do that was revealing of an aspect of the US-Saudi relationship that to that point had not come to light. We have in the United States a sort of 50-year rule regarding the declassification of information, which means that in 2023, it became possible to talk about the fact that some of the parastatal entities, such as the Muslim World League and the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, associated closely with and funded by Saudi Arabia, that were literally using billions of petrodollars over the years to support religious causes around the world, and again, often viewed as laying the groundwork for the later growth of extremist interpretations of Islam. Those organizations were actually partners of the United States intelligence community in certain countries. The Muslim World League would publish like Islamic magazines in local languages, many parts of the Muslim majority world. And in fact, many of the articles published in those magazines were actually written in CIA headquarters outside Washington, D.C., translated into the relevant local languages, and then distributed through the mechanisms of these Saudi-linked parastatal Islamic organizations. And of course, these were the articles that were talking about the dangers of socialism and communism, right? So the Crown Prince may have been overstating the case, but there was a relationship between the dynamics of what I call, as you'll see, Saudi religious transnationalism and US foreign policy. Now, Saudi Arabia is a fascinating case to look at, right? Because it's a country that I think really nicely embodies this notion, this Gregorio Batiza notion of sacred capital, right? By dint of the fact that the two holiest sites of Islam are located in Saudi Arabia, it gives the Al Saud, the royal family of Saudi Arabia, the ability to position themselves or to seek to position themselves as leaders of the Muslim world more broadly. And one of the ways that Saudi Arabia has done that is precisely through the use of not insignificant amounts of oil revenue in order to support various da'wah, propagatory activities and support for religious causes, which has taken many forms, from the donation of textbooks to religious schools, to the direct funding of those schools, to providing scholarships and training for religious scholars from other countries to come to Saudi Arabia and then go back to their home countries. And there's been this long-standing debate and discussion about the extent of this. How much of this has been going on and what has the impact of it been? And it's been a very politicized, because there are certain groups that have kind of argued that Saudi Arabia's efforts to export the very kind of austere, rigid Salafi, the sort of distinctive Saudi form of Salafi Islam, commonly referred to as Wahhabism, and whether Wahhabism is actually a thing is a separate conversation we can have. Regardless, there's certainly a discourse about Wahhabism, which is what I'm kind of referring to in the title of this book that came out a few years ago that tries to explore this in detail. But there are those who've argued that this Saudi religious transnationalism has been the source of extremism linked to the eventual growth of support for groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS down the line. And so therefore, in their minds, there's a direct set of dots to be tied between the Saudi religious propagation activity and then various forms of militant Islamic extremism down the line. Others have said, yes, this is going on, and it has certainly been linked to the growth of conservative trends in certain parts of the world, but to sort of claim that there's this Wahhabi wrecking ball that comes crashing through the sort of pristine, moderate local Islams of all of these different countries isn't quite accurate. And this debate had tended to take place at one of these two extremes. Either it's the root of all evil, or there's nothing problematic going on at all. And so I wanted to get a better and more nuanced understanding of what this all looked like. And so that this question of trying to understand the nature and impact of Saudi religious transnationalism became an early focus of this Geopolitics of Religion project, culminating in that book. And what our research there shows is that this trend of Saudi religious transnationalism absolutely is a recognizable and distinctive component of Saudi Arabia's external relations starting in the 1960s. But it has multiple dimensions to it. One thing that became very clear through the work that we did here is that there's not like this global Wahhabi command and control center in Riyadh where they're trying to decide which country's Islam should we mess up next and diverting the funds. What you actually see are different groups within Saudi Arabia competing with each other in ways that the support and the appearance of Saudi's religious funding in other countries is itself often expressive of rivalries and factions within Saudi domestic politics. And the primary driver of the dynamics of this funding and the destinations, the geography of it, really shifts over time. Because when it first begins, a lot of it actually is I think, representative of a genuine sense of religious obligation on the part of the Saudi royal family, that because of who they are and the nature of their country and its role in Islam more broadly, they have a responsibility to advance the religion and to support Islamic causes. So I think it's important to not simply reduce all of this to mere geopolitical instrumentality. That said, by the mid-1960s, it's very clear that for Saudi Arabia, a focus on Islam and supporting Islamic causes internationally is important in the context of broader regional rivalries in the Middle East at the time, right? This was the time when, in the eyes of Saudi Arabia, their primary regional rival was the more secular national pan-Arabism of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, right? And support of Islamic causes becomes a useful way to counter the influence of pan-Arabism. We also, from 1979 onwards, see that dynamic shift such that a lot of the work becomes focused less on countering Egyptian influence and more on countering Iranian influence in the aftermath of the 1979 revolution in Iran. You suddenly see this upsurge of Saudi support for religious causes, for Islamic causes in sub-Saharan Africa that appears in the 1990s. If you're charting the flows of the money, there's very little in sub-Saharan Africa until the 90s, and then suddenly it goes huge amounts of money. And when you dig into what was going on there, this was a period of time when Pentecostal and evangelical Christianity was growing rapidly in sub-Saharan Africa. And so you would have local Muslim groups worried about these very energetic and vibrant Christian dynamics, and knowing that there's money over there in Saudi Arabia, would basically call up the Saudis and say, you need to send support and help. The Christians are taking over here. And so suddenly you'd see all this Saudi money for Islamic causes going into sub-Saharan Africa. But really, in its most recent phase, the most recent phase of Saudi religious transnationalism, which I think it's worth noting that the amount of this, in terms of the volumes of funding that we're seeing, has been decreasing significantly over the last 20 years. There's a variety of reasons for that. When it has been present, that sort of countering the influence of Iran factor, I think, is still very present. But I think it also speaks to a fundamental shift in the way that Saudi Arabia has tried to reboot its geopolitical religious identity, both regionally and globally. The current Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has significantly curtailed the authority and the capacity of the country's religious establishment, including in terms of its ability to project influence and send funding abroad, and has instead shifted to a modality of religious engagement that has turned heads because it has focused on things like interreligious tolerance, coexistence, and talking about, for example, the dangers of anti-Semitism, which is really head-spinning to people who have been following this trend over the long term, because in the 1970s and 80s, some of these parastatal organizations associated with Saudi Arabia were very directly implicated in the transmission of various forms of materials and discourse and media that actually promoted anti-Semitism. And now, under Mohammed bin Salman, we have a sort of hand-picked Secretary General of, for example, the Muslim World League, who visited Auschwitz and who's been giving speeches about the dangers of anti-Semitism. And it's a fundamental shift to trying to cultivate an image of Saudi Arabia as a country open to and committed to interfaith tolerance and coexistence and pluralism. And on the one hand, there's a strong, I think it's fair to say, public relations dimension to that. How much of this is PR versus how much of it is representative of a genuine shift in the way that religion is understood and shift in the kind of configuration of religious norms in Saudi Arabia. But there's also, I think it's fair to say, an underlying kind of political economy to it as well. And so far as, as you'll probably be aware, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's primary project has been this whole Vision 2030 thing, right? A sort of effort to wean Saudi Arabia off its reliance on petrodollars and shifting towards a new portfolio of global investments in Asia, significant investment in leisure and entertainment industries, right? So, and those of you who have watched the growth of the Saudi pro football leagues and their sort of shopping sprees of top European players, major iconic pop stars giving concerts in Saudi Arabia. And at some level, you have to, in order for this global engagement effort to be successful, you have to be able to send signals that our society is comfortable with different people of different backgrounds. We're open to that. We're globalizing, we're opening up, right? Saudi Arabia for the longest term was a country that you couldn't visit. There was no such thing as a tourist category visa until 2 years ago, right? And now as part of this opening, it needs to be accompanied by a new kind of cultural opening. But at the same time, there are many who point to the fact that a lot of this interfaith activity seems to be more of a spectacle rather than substance, right? It means they will run these nice summits and conferences every few months where they fly in religious leaders from around the world who gather and sit and listen to each other give speeches. And at the end of it, they issue a very nice but anodyne sounding statement about how everyone has common beliefs and all people of all faiths need to respect and live and love each other and yada, yada, yada. It sounds very nice, but there's never really any follow-up in terms of action. And indeed, many have pointed to the fact that this at times seems to have the appearance of creating a smokescreen or sort of whitewashing other aspects of the foreign policies of the countries that are involved in it. And this is not exclusively a Saudi enterprise. The United Arab Emirates is involved in it. Doha, our friends in Qatar are involved in it as well. That it's an effort to distract from the fact that other aspects of the regional and foreign policies are maybe not quite as open to pluralism and maybe actually generate some of the dynamics around conflict and violence elsewhere in the region. Let me briefly touch comparatively on Iran, because the sort of Iran-Saudi competition in the religious sphere has been fascinating to observe. I mean, most discourse and commentary on Iranian religious engagement internationally, certainly in the immediate aftermath of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, focused on the idea or a concern that we were going to see an export of Iran's revolutionary form of Shia Islam kind of across the region. And that didn't happen for any number of reasons, but there are aspects of how Iran has deployed what I call religious soft power that has actually allowed it to build certain tendrils of connectivity and solidarity with parts of the world in ways that I think are not always appreciated. And just to telegraph where I'm going with this, in my observation, I think Iran has actually been much more nuanced and sophisticated in terms of the ways that it has deployed its sacred capital when compared to its. In terms of the way that the Islamic Revolution in Iran is generally read, I think we often fail to realize that while it's frequently talked about as an Islamic revolution by its own self-description, it also spoke and resonated in parts of the world that were caught up in the throes of decolonization and the messy geopolitics that emerged out of the process of decolonization. Countries that had just thrown off the mantle and yoke of European imperialism to become independent after World War II, only to immediately be told that you have to sign up to be either on the Soviet side or the US side, right? You've got to be part of one of those people in order to work and operate in the world. And one of the things that the new Iranian government under Khomeini tried to telegraph very clearly is that we in Iran, we have this third way. We are going to be critical of the Americans, we're going to be critical of the Soviets, we have this third path. And so I think even in countries that were not majority Shia Muslim, even in countries that were not majority Muslim, where other religious traditions were the majority, but that happened to be in the global South, or in the process of decolonization, there sprang up a certain sense of respect and admiration for what Iran had accomplished. And the Iranians have over time built on those connections of counter-hegemonic solidarity as a form of soft power. So there is, as part of the Iranian state, there is this agency called the Islamic Culture and Relations Organization that is responsible for most of the activities that have been about exporting support for religious causes. And yes, some of this is about reaching out to and building connections with particularly embattled and dispossessed Shia minority populations in countries like Bahrain and the Persian Gulf region. But if your religious export activity is exclusively limited to Shia outreach, there's natural limitations built in there, given that a very small percentage of the world's overall Muslim population is Shia. But this is where Iran, I think, has been extremely creative, right? Because there are countries that are not Shia majority, where Iran has mainly deployed the cultural symbols historically of Shia suppression and dispossession, and purpose these as broader symbols of combating neo-imperialism that has allowed it to build connections on the backs of religious symbols with a much wider variety of settings beyond the Shia majority world. I talked about them being quite nuanced and sophisticated in how there's one particular example of this that I encountered some years back that I want to share with you. I've been using this example for years because it's one of my favorites, and it was just really eye-opening for me. I was visiting the National Islamic University in Indonesia, in South Jakarta, some years back. And this was a period of time when the United States was on a big sort of public relations outreach spree to the Muslim majority world in the aftermath of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where public attitudes towards the United States had plummeted all around the world. So the US was trying to make nice with the Muslims globally. And one of the things they were doing is they were going to universities around the world, particularly in the Muslim majority world, and creating at these universities these things called American corners. And this was part of our what we call public diplomacy programs. And it means you create like a kiosk in a public area of the university where there's like books and videos and an internet connection and people can learn about life in America. And there's the State Department created these sort of glossy magazines about how American Muslims are so happy and they love being American and Muslim and look, they play basketball and hijab. It's ridiculous, but this is American public diplomacy outreach. And so my host at the university was walking me through one of the main buildings, and he pointed to this American corner, which was deserted, gathering dust, and they shoved it off in the corner. Nothing going on there, no action. And then he laughed and pointed up to the one floor up. So I followed his finger. What did I see? Welcome to Iranian Corner. And he told me that the Iranian ambassador to Indonesia had visited the university about 6 months previous and had seen American Corner. And so they called Tehran, and within 6 weeks, they had set up Iranian Corner. I looked up there and it was packed out. Everyone was in Iranian Corner. And so of course I wanted to know what's in Iranian Corner, what's going on there. So I went upstairs. It speaks to my own capture by certain stereotypes that I expected to go in and find a set of icons speaking to the glories of the Islamic Revolution, right? Photos of Khomeini giving fiery speeches. Nothing of the sort. Nothing like that. Nothing political at all. Iranian Corner was a library devoted to historical Persian contributions to Sufi Islam, right, which was the sort of dominant trend within the National Islamic University scene. Right? So talk about knowing your audience. This to me was brilliant, right? Because the basic message, which is, hey, if you're into Sufism, you should know that historically our country has been a source of a lot of it. And this explains exactly why it was so successful, why Iranian corner was so packed out. So finally, and just to end up, why is this material significant? For many years, the dominance of realism and realpolitik in international relations suggested that religion is not that important. Right? We don't need to really take religion into account in trying to explain and understand things going on in the world of international relations. Today, in contrast, we seem to see religion being deployed as a tool of realpolitik, as a way to achieve specific national security goals and objectives. In a time when I feel, I originally wrote this as a question, are we witnessing a shift in the structure and nature of world order? I think we clearly are. And there are ways in which this kind of new geopolitics of religion, this advent of new phases of religious diplomacy, I think, are also allowing for the creation of certain forms of connectivity and changing alliance structures. And this is something that I think Putin is actually doing very well, right? You're familiar with this whole Ruski Mir concept, right? Which at one level seems to be speaking to the idea of the primacy of ethno-linguistic Russian, and perhaps by extension Slavic and Orthodox Christian identity. And it certainly is that in its Russia and near abroad manifestations. But there are other registers and orders that Putin is able to deploy in the context of Ruski Mir outreach activities, in which he taps into different dimensions of it that are relevant for other kinds of audiences, right? So when speaking to sub-Saharan Africa, right, where you don't have a lot of ethno-linguistic Russians or Orthodox Christians, he's able to reframe the Ruski Mir project in a way that positions or seeks to position Russia as the global guardian and champion of traditional and family values. And so it's this idea, when you look at the kinds of discourses and media activities founded by entities adjacent to the Russian Orthodox Church in sub-Saharan Africa, it's this idea that Europe and North America, pre-Trump, are aggressively exporting LGBTQ+ rights, transgender ideology, feminism. And so Russia, it comes in saying, look, we know that those are not your values are closer to ours, and so you need to connect with us because we are the ones who actually respect who you are and your values and will help you push back the efforts by the West to export progressive ideologies. And so it's, I think, a very powerful example of the ways in which this new religious diplomacy is about broader shifts. I also think that any moment such as the one we're living in now, which I think is fair to thematize as the emergence of a post-Western world, these moments where we know that what has been the configuration of world order to date is changing, but we don't quite know what the new world order looks like, this sort of interregnum period. These are natural periods of time when people tend to go in search of ideas, organizing principles. You need meaning, right? We need something to grab on to help us reorganize world order. And I think during those kinds of moments, questions, culture and religion as sources, primary sources in many parts of the world for meaning, ideas, and values take on renewed significance. And so I think that's another reason why, at this present moment, we need to better appreciate the emergence of this kind of new geopolitics of. So I'm going to leave it at that and very much look forward to your reactions and thoughts and questions. Thank you.
So that those online can hear the questions, we will be using the microphone. So if you have a question, please wait till the microphone arrives.
Peter, thank you very much for the talk. I agree with almost everything you said. It makes a lot of sense. One thing I'd slightly like to push back on, perhaps, is when you were talking about Saudi Arabia and its sort of interfaith work at the moment, and you didn't mention CAICID.
Yeah.
And of course, that King Abdullah Centre for International and Intercultural
Yes.
Dialogue would be a very large part of this. And I think that you've said there's lots of whitewashing here.
Yeah.
I think that is perhaps slightly unfair. You mentioned this, I wrote an article a couple of years ago to be based in international affairs on Bible dialogue washing.
Yeah.
And I examined Saudi as one example.
Yes.
And I said, actually, there's these big events, yes, and these do nothing.
Yeah.
But they do an awful lot of work in places like in Central Africa, in Myanmar, where they're training peace builders, they're training people in dialogue skills, they're training sort of youth groups, they're working with scouts now.
Yeah.
And I'm actually involved in them in Southeast Asia on a sort of a city project there, doing bits of work. So I think it's maybe unfair to see all of this as this whitewashing with actually no effect, because actually on the ground, they're having a huge effect in many places.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there is an exception in the case of CAICID. For those of you who are not familiar with it, this is the King Abdullah International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue, technically an intergovernmental organization, originally headquartered in Vienna, Austria. Due to shifts in the domestic political landscape of Austria, CAICID was asked to leave, and it has resettled itself in Lisbon, Portugal now. When CAICID first emerged, I'll say I was rather skeptical of it, and I think it took them a few years, but then I would agree with you that they do some interesting and important work. I don't know that, I have not looked at it in sufficient depth to make an assessment with respect to the scale of the impact. But when I look at the nature of the activities, and when I look at the people that they've hired to design and lead the implementation of those activities, these are serious practitioners and scholars. So I agree that there is something going on there. I think, unfortunately, obviously, it suffers from a certain political impediment insofar as it is associated with the previous king, and the extent to which it commands the attention and largesse of the present ruling disposition of Saudi Arabia means that there are and will continue to be questions about its funding. And so fair point taken there. I think when I express skepticism, it's more with respect to this endless parade of summits and conferences and declarations in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha. So I don't want to hold Saudi Arabia exclusively guilty here. I have, and I've put this very directly to Sheikh Mohammed Al-Isa, the Secretary General of the Muslim World League, after his trip to Auschwitz and talking about the dangers of anti-Semitism, which is to say, Your Excellency, I welcome these messages. It's fantastic to hear Saudi Arabia saying these things. Are Muslim World League country and regional offices around the world now putting resources behind educational and programmatic activities that reflect the things you're saying? They're not. Which is why the expressions of this associated with the current ruling disposition are ones that I'm inclined to, again, I don't think that whitewashing and dialogue washing is the full story here. I think there are maybe aspects of that. I actually think that the current Crown Prince sees more value in the instrumentality of it as one dimension of, or as an enabling aspect of his broader Vision 2030 project, which is different from saying that the Saudis are doing this just to distract from conflict generating and human rights violations. But I think you're right to point to CAICID as an important exception to that trend.
Do you also see it as like shifting the central politics, let's say from democracy post-Second World War, organizing the world towards like more imperial way of thinking, organizing the world through religious groups, where leaders represent the religious groups rather than each person representing themselves? That is how I see it also.
When I look at this broad global landscape, I see contrasting trends. I think there's some evidence in the direction that you're talking about, certainly around the ways in which some of this activity tries to organize people around broader cultural and civilizational commitments, and the idea that certain individuals, not political systems, but individuals are the guardians of those civilizational projects. And so one needs to follow and support and respect them. Aspects of that, I didn't get to the Turkish case, but you certainly see aspects of it, I think, of that in the Turkish case. But I really think it is most pronounced in the Russian case. And I think it will be increasingly pronounced in the the US case under Trump. We've already seen the rapidity with which Trump has sidled right up to Putin. And we saw this like dizzying overnight inversion of the American discourse on the war in Ukraine. Ukraine started it. And we have Trump basically talking from a sheet of Moscow generated messages rapidly. And there is, one of the most difficult things, I think, for the American national security apparatus to get its head around with respect to this sort of Russian religious export activity is that the temptation was to analyze it and treat it as an example of problematic things that Russia is doing. The uncomfortable truth of the bigger picture of it, though, is that there are many conservative American evangelical groups connected to and working very closely with these foundations tied to the Russian Orthodox Church in doing this work, right? And so there is an enabling layer at the level of values and culture through religion that creates, that I think will be part of this new Russia-US emerging relationship going forward. And I do agree with you that there are anti-democratic dimensions to it. But I don't think that's the full story of religion and democracy in the world today, because in many contexts that I've looked at over the last 10 years or so, I've seen numerous cases in places like Kenya and Malawi, for example, where when the government there has closed down press freedom or gone after opposition groups that have criticized them, religious groups in those countries that know that they enjoy a certain kind of standing in society that's untouchable compared to other aspects of civil society, have put a protective cloak over the media or opposition groups and saying to the government, if you are going to mess with them, you have to go through us. Although, again, that's more an aspect of the domestic disposition of religion in those countries than it is the kind of transnational religion that we're talking about. My basic concern is that the direction you're going in your question is what we're starting to see more of at an aggregate level globally. Please, yeah.
I'm a bit breathless. I want to speak slowly. My question is about actually MBS. To what extent do you see these activities in Vision 2030 as maintaining Saudi's position in the world, or is he actually de-emphasizing Saudi's religious position? Or it seems to be a great change from the regimes that came before, that were others, as you said. That's my general question. I've got a specific question. I'm a PhD student here, and my research looks at the Islamic calendar. I don't know if you know about this, but one of the features of the Islamic calendar is that Saudi Arabia every year claims to see the moon for Ramadan and Eid. They claim to see it a day or two before scientifically visible to be seen.
Yes.
And what we have are states around the world following Saudi Arabia, whilst claiming to follow their own society, actually following. And we even have the phenomena of copycat sightings, where we have people in other parts of the world, they're always the same individuals in always the same region, who claim to miraculously say, oh, we have seen the moon, which happens to align with Saudi's moon.
Yes.
I think it started in the 70s or 80s. I haven't tracked it.
Yes.
Do you know much about the calendar and
Yeah, I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia, which is why I follow it so obsessively. And I'm fascinated by your work because I have so often observed this sort of politics of lunar sighting that you're talking about, and always found it in the back of my mind as, ooh, that's something I should look at in my work someday, because I think it's a wonderful site at which to observe some of these dynamics. So I'm really glad that you're doing that work, and I will look forward to reading it. I think that Mohammed bin Salman's posture with respect to Saudi Arabia's role in the broader Muslim world is, like everything he does, pragmatic in nature. Even, I think you probably would have heard from what I've said, you would have heard me to be suggesting that under Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi Arabia's export of Wahhabism, that whole trend, that's more or less gone. We're finished with that. It's not actually true. And this is where I think that he's absolutely a pragmatist. While I think that he has found it to be geopolitically, geoeconomically, geostrategically useful to cut back on that activity, knowing that it potentially endangers other priorities of his, he has preserved and actively supported the continued use of it in certain limited ways. More specifically, with respect to efforts to blunt Iranian influence in specific locales across the Middle East. So even after clipping the wings of the religious establishment, there have been several moments over the last couple of years, as recently as that, when he has signed off on the deployment of ulama from the Saudi religious establishment to go on lecture tours in parts of the Arab world that were perceived as being on the receiving end of Iranian influence operations. And they're all there to give lectures focused on the sort of dangers of Shiism in various coded ways, which of course is just an indirect way of preaching about the dangers of Iran. I suspect that my sense is that in some ways there's an emerging Ottoman model here, in the sense that he is trying to bring Saudi Arabia's leadership of the Muslim world into greater alignment with Saudi Arabia's geopolitical influence in the Middle East more broadly, but globally as well, leaning into the religious side of things again when useful, but first and foremost, seeking to create new paradigms of political order in the Middle East more broadly. And again, his efforts to curb and cut back on the presence of the religious establishment, taking the religious police, the mutawa, off the streets of all cities and towns, I don't think that says anything about any anti-religious inclinations that he has. I think it's simply about his centralization of authority, right? Because there used to be this long-standing narrative, oh, in Saudi Arabia, you have this very delicate balance and symbiosis between the religious establishment and the royal family, and they each need each other. The royal family needs the religious establishment to provide an Islamic justification for their activities. And I think what he's saying in this age of old models being thrown out the window, he's saying, no, we actually don't need you at all, because the young people of this country like the direction I'm going on. And so I feel very confident basically writing the religious establishment out of the picture or putting you in the background until I need to make instrumental use of you for certain specific projects. That's how I read it.
We started a little late. We're finishing just past time, but I have come up to say thank you very much to Dr. Peter Mandaville for an excellent talk and discussion, and I know this conversation could go on for hours.